Revelation chapter 3, verse 9, which says, "Behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee." And in this verse, we find the Lord who is addressing the church in Philadelphia. It's written to the angel or the messenger of the church in Philadelphia. And what God is saying here is to the churches. He repeatedly tells us that after each of the 7 addresses, he states, "He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches." Now, why is God mentioning the synagogue of Satan, and why is he concerned about those that say they are Jews and are not? This is not an address to the nation of Israel. This is not an address to Judah. It's not concerning the tribes of Israel. God is not really focused upon Israel any longer. The book of Revelation is the last book of the Bible, which was written near the end of the 1st century AD, and God has, for some time already at this point, he is finished with the nation of Israel. Remember, it was back in 33 AD that the Lord rent the veil of the temple. He ripped it in two and exposed the Holy of Holies. And he did that to indicate that it no longer was the Holy of Holies, that the temple was no longer the holy place, Jerusalem was no longer the holy city, and that the Jews were no longer the holy people. They were not his representatives to the rest of the world any longer. God finished with them. He ended his relationship. He divorced national Israel. He never again had any real plan for them, except they fit in as just a nation amongst the other nations of the world. And he had a plan at the time of the end to regather them, that they would become a nation, to highlight and to emphasize that the world was reaching or nearing that time of the end. But God had no plan to use them in the way that he had done for the many centuries of the Old Testament age. It was now a new age. It was the church age that began on the day of Pentecost in 33 AD. And by the time the book of Revelation is being written, as God is moving the Apostle John to write these things, it's some 50 or 60 years later or more. And that's several decades later. And yet God is still making reference to synagogues and to Jews, those that say they are Jews and are not, but they do lie. As if God is very concerned about this, and he was concerned about that when he was using the Jewish people as his representatives of his kingdom, but he is no longer doing that. So why is the Lord using this language? Well, if you remember back in Revelation chapter 2, when God was addressing the church in Smyrna, he said in verse 8, "And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works and tribulation and poverty." Now he's speaking to the people at Smyrna, and once again, we want to keep this in mind. It is also being said to those in the churches throughout the centuries of the church age. "I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan." And the Lord is indicating that this has to do with the people at Smyrna, the people in the churches. That's why he says, as he writes to Pergamos in verse 12, "These things saith he which has the sharp sword with two edges." And then in verse 13, "I know thy works, and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is, and holdest fast my name, and has not denied my faith." And you see, Satan had a seat in the church. He had rule within churches and congregations. And that's why the Lord is making this reference to the synagogue of Satan. Because there were churches that had been infiltrated by the enemy, as he had sown tares amongst the wheat, and they had ascended to places of authority and power in the congregation, so that they began to rule. And their doctrines were the main doctrines, and their teachings were what the people were hearing. And this was the case in many churches, as even whole denominations, sometimes enormous denominations, fell prey to the devil and were deceived into thinking that they could add or subtract from the Word of God all throughout the church age. And as a result, they became a synagogue of Satan. Now, the word synagogue, the Greek word, is also translated in the New Testament as assembly. In James 2, verse 2, it says, "For if there come unto your assembly a man with a gold ring and goodly apparel, and there come in also a poor man in vile raiment, and ye have respect to him that weareth the gay clothing, and say unto him, Sit thou here in a good place, and say to the poor, Stand thou there, or sit here under my footstool." And here the word assembly, if there come unto your assembly a man with a gold ring. And that's the word that is translated as synagogue. And it has application to the church. This word is also translated as congregation. In Acts chapter 13, verses 42 and 43, "And when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Now when the congregation was broken up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God." When the congregation was broken up, and that word congregation is the same word as synagogue that's in the previous verse, Acts 13, verse 42. It is a word that means a gathering, an assembly, when people congregate and come together. And that's exactly what the church is. But God is using the picture of Israel. He's doing this intentionally as he makes these statements. One reason the Lord is speaking of the synagogue of Satan and about them which say they are Jews and are not but do lie. One main reason that God does that is in order to hide truth from those that are not his people. And just to hide truth, God hides truth from everyone. He reveals truth to his people. He keeps it hidden to those that are not. But we could say the truth is hidden from everyone, all people. And this is God's way of writing the Bible. He spoke in parables, and without a parable he did not speak. And therefore he is hiding truth from the New Testament people. Identifying the New Testament churches and congregations as Israel, or other synonymous statements, Israel, Judah, Judea, Jerusalem, things like that, have allowed the Lord to hide much truth from the unsaved in the churches, so they're not all that concerned when they hear about God's judgment upon them. After all, let's read, for instance, in Matthew 24, where it says in verse 14, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." And that's the focus of Matthew 24. Jesus answering the disciples' question, "What shall be the sign of thy coming in the end of the world?" And yet here's what we read concerning the end in verse 15. "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." Well, you see the churches read this, and they think it's referring to Judah of the first century, when the Romans came against it. There's a theological point of view known as preterism that teaches Matthew 24 had its fulfillment in 70 AD. Of course it didn't. the whole chapter is answering the disciples' question back in verse 3, and it was a very specific question: what shall be the sign of thy coming in the end of the world? And then Jesus does that very thing. He answers their question. And yet God, speaking in parabolic language, by continuing to speak of the church as Judea, by continuing to liken the churches to a holy place as the temple was, well, he's hiding his plan to end the church age. We would think that there would be constant references to the Lord's plan concerning the churches, and yet you read more of Israel, you read more of Judah, you read more of Jews than you do of God's plan for the churches. And the reason, again, is that God is speaking of the churches. He is discussing the congregations when he uses this language. He wants us to understand, think of Israel when you're reading the Old Testament as a type and a figure, as an example of the New Testament church. Yes, that little nation who I spent so much time talking about and discussing. So much of the scriptures deals with Israel, and yet they only numbered a few million at best. And you see, God is very much concerned with the church age, because the churches would grow to populations in the billions. Today we have about 2 billion professed Christians, and so we can see why God would use the lesser number with Israel in order to picture and typify the greater number of those that would eventually enter into the New Testament churches. And that's exactly what he's done. And he calls Israel the church in the wilderness, and he refers to Christians as Jews. And that's why the Lord is making this reference to synagogues and to Jews. This has to do with the people in the churches.